Alejandro Vega had just returned from a week of business in Dubai when he saw a scene that broke his heart. Her 6-year-old son Pablo was crying outside the neighbor's door, his hands reaching for a plate of food, begging for something to eat. The boy was so thin that his clothes hung off his body. He had deep dark circles under his eyes, and he trembled as he begged for mercy. Alejandro, one of the richest men in Spain and owner of a $300 million financial empire, couldn't believe what he was seeing. How was it possible that his son was literally starving to death in his $5 million villa in La Moraleja? Who was the woman who was taking care of Paul during his absence? And above all, where the hell was Carmen, the housekeeper who paid $5,000 a month precisely to avoid situations like this? What Alejandro discovered in the next few minutes would forever change his relationship with money, success, and paternal love. Alejandro Vega had always believed that loving a child meant giving him everything money could buy. At 42, he had managed to build a financial empire from scratch. Vega Holdings controlled real estate, technology, and energy investments across half of Europe. He owned properties in Madrid, Barcelona, Marbella, and New York, a collection of dream cars, and a private jet that he used to constantly commute between work meetings. His son Pablo was 7 years old and lived in the family chalet in La Moraleja, a 2,000 square meters mansion surrounded by 10 hectares of garden. In theory, the boy had it all: expensive toys, designer clothes, a room as big as a normal apartment, a highly paid private housekeeper, and a bank account many adults would envy. In practice, Paul had everything except the most important thing: a present father. Alejandro spent at least 20 days a month away from home. When I was in Madrid, I would leave at 6 in the morning and return after 10 at night, often when Pablo was already asleep. Weekends were devoted to business dinners, social events, and impromptu trips to close urgent business deals. She had completely delegated the care of her son to Carmen Ruiz, a 50-year-old housekeeper with excellent references and a salary that made her one of the highest-paid domestic workers in Spain. Pablo's mother, Isabel, had died in a traffic accident when the boy was 3 years old. Since then, Alejandro had drowned the pain of loss even further in his work, convincing himself that the only way to honor his wife's memory was to guarantee Pablo a financially secure future. Every million earned was another brick in the edifice of security he was building for his son. But Alejandro had never really spoken to Pablo. I didn't know what his favorite games were, if he was doing well in school, if he had friends, if he was happy or sad. The only information he received came through Carmen, who during their very brief phone calls always assured him that everything was fine and that Pablo was a quiet, well-behaved child. This week in September, Alejandro had flown to Dubai to finalize the acquisition of an energy company valued at $50 million. It had been the most important coup of his career, the one that would definitively project him into the elite of international finance. Don Perignon had celebrated with champagne in the penthouse of the Burghaller, imagining how to invest the profits to guarantee Pablo an even more golden future. The return flight had landed in Barajas at 4 p.m. on Friday. Alejandro had taken his Lamborghini from the beep parking garage and driven home whistling, excited by the idea of telling Carmen about the success of the business. Maybe for once he would also take Pablo out to dinner to celebrate, but when he entered the path to the chalet, what he saw paralyzed him. Through the hedge that separated his property from the neighbors, he glimpsed a small, thin figure huddled in front of the Gonzalez family's door. It was a boy wearing a yellow t-shirt that was too big and crying desperately. Alejandro stopped the car and took a better look. His blood ran cold in his veins when he recognized that child. It was Pablo, his son, who was begging the neighbors to give him food. The child was unrecognizable. I had lost at least 5 kilos. The cheeks were sunken, the eyes sunken, surrounded by violet dark circles. The clothes that once fit him perfectly now hung on him like rags. She trembled as she reached out for the plate Mrs. Gonzalez was offering her with obvious compassion. Alejandro got out of the car, feeling his legs tremble. I couldn't connect the image of that malnourished child with the son I had left behind 7 days earlier. What the hell had happened in a week? When Pablo saw him, instead of running towards him, As any child happy to see his father again would have done, he huddled against the neighbor's door, as if he were afraid. His eyes, once bright and curious, were now dull and filled with a sadness that should never exist in the eyes of a 7-year-old. Alejandro felt like the world was falling on him. At that moment, he understood that all his millions, all his successes, all his properties meant nothing if his son was literally starving to death just a few meters from the most luxurious villa in the neighborhood. What he was about to discover would forever shatter his certainties about fatherhood, money, and the meaning of success. Alejandro slowly approached Pablo, trying to control the panic that rose in his throat. The boy looked at him with eyes that showed not joy or relief, but something much more disturbing, resignation, as if he had learned not to expect anything good from his father. Mrs. Gonzalez, a 60-year-old woman who had known the family for years, stood up from the step where she was kneeling next to Pablo. In her eyes, Alejandro saw a mixture of rage and pity that made him feel like the worst human being in the world. When Alejandro asked what had happened, Mrs. Gonzalez couldn't contain herself. With a voice trembling with indignation, he began to recount what he had seen in recent days. Pablo came knocking on her door every morning at 7 a.m. saying he was hungry and that there was nothing to eat at home. At first, I thought the boy was exaggerating, as children often do when they want candy or snacks. But then I noticed that Pablo was getting thinner and thinner. His clothes were beginning to seem too big. His face was sinking. His energy was fading. When I tried to call Casa Vega's number to speak to the housekeeper, no one had ever answered. Alejandro's cell phone was always busy or turned off. The truth was even more shocking. Carmen Ruiz had left work 3 days after Alejandro's departure for Dubai, without saying a word to anyone. She had simply packed her bags and left, leaving Pablo completely alone in that enormous mansion. A 7-year-old boy, with no adult to care for him, forced to survive on whatever he could find in the refrigerator until that too was gone. Alejandro felt his legs give out. He collapsed on the steps next to his son, realizing the monstrosity of what had happened. Pablo had spent 4 days alone, without food, without anyone to comfort him when he was scared at night, without anyone noticing that he was literally disappearing. The boy had tried to manage as best he could. I had finished all the cookies in the pantry. He had eaten dry cereal because he didn't know how to use the stove, had drunk tap water to fill his empty stomach. When that was over, too, he started calling his neighbors, too young to understand that what he was experiencing was not normal. The Gonzalezes had fed him every time he came, but they were simple people who didn't know how to handle a situation like that. They had thought about calling social services, but they didn't want to cause problems for a wealthy and influential family. They had hoped that Alexander would return soon and that everything would be resolved. Now, Alejandro looked at his son and saw the consequences of his negligence written on every inch of that small, fragile body. Pablo no longer cried, no longer asked questions, no longer demanded explanations. He was simply sitting there next to a father who had managed to build a financial empire, but had failed in the most important thing, protecting the only person he had in the world. When Alejandro tried to take him in his arms, Pablo did not resist, but he did not surrender to his embrace either. It was as if the child had learned not to expect anything good from adults, not even from his own father. Alejandro took him home, to that mansion full of expensive objects and empty of human warmth. He opened the fridge and realized that Carmen had left only some expired yogurts and a spoiled bottle of milk. The pantries were empty, the kitchen cold and unused. While preparing a meal for Pablo with what he could find, Alejandro began to understand the enormity of his failure as a father. I had thought that love meant leaving $1 million inheritance, ensuring financial security, buying everything a child could want. But I had forgotten the simplest and most fundamental thing: being present, being the safe haven a child can return to when the world becomes too big and scary. Be the person who notices when something is wrong, who notices whether your child is happy or sad, who knows their favorite foods and their nighttime fears. That night, Alejandro didn't sleep. He sat by Pablo's bed, looking at that little body that was breathing regularly after finally eating something nutritious. He realized he had to choose between remaining the richest man in an emotional graveyard or learning to be the father Pablo had always deserved but never had. The days that followed were the most difficult of Alejandro's life. For the first time in his 20-year career, he canceled all his appointments and turned off his company phone. The world of finance could wait. His son could not wait any longer. It took Pablo almost a week to eat normally again. Alejandro had to feed him small portions every 2 hours, as is done with newborns. Every bite the child managed to hold down was a small victory, but the real damage was emotional. Pablo had become a silent child who didn't ask questions, didn't express his wishes. He had learned that adults disappear, that you can't count on anyone. The decisive moment came one night when Alejandro heard Pablo crying. She found him curled up in bed, shaken by nightmares. When asked what he had dreamed, Pablo whispered that he had dreamed he was alone again. Alejandro took him in his arms and for the first time cried in front of his son. He asked for forgiveness for having abandoned him. He promised him that he would never be alone again. Pablo completely abandoned himself to his father's embrace, and Alejandro understood that it was the first time his son truly trusted him. In the following days, Alejandro began to really get to know Pablo. He discovered that he loved adventure books. He had a passion for animals. He drew with natural talent. He was also terribly lonely. I had no real friends. Alejandro made radical decisions. He reduced his work commitments to the essentials, sold properties that required too much travel. He transformed one of the offices into a game room. He enrolled Pablo in a regular school instead of the private boarding school. Are you enjoying this story? Leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now we continue with the video. Every afternoon, I helped Pablo with his homework. He wasn't as good as Carmen, but his presence was what mattered. Weekends became sacred. Just him and Pablo exploring Madrid, going to the park, eating ice cream like a normal family. Slowly, he watched the silent boy transform back into the lively son he had always been. Pablo started asking questions, telling stories about school, and laughing at Alejandro's jokes. The real test came when Alexander had to travel to London. Instead of leaving Pablo with one of the keys, he took it with him. During the flight, Pablo told him that he was no longer afraid, because he knew his dad would always come back. 6 months after that terrible discovery, the Vegas chalet had become a completely different place. The once silent rooms now echoed with Pablo's laughter and the noise of his games. Alejandro had learned that a house full of life is much more beautiful than a house full of expensive objects. The most evident change was in Paul himself. The thin, frightened boy had become healthy and lively. She had gained weight. Her cheeks had become pink again. Her eyes were shining again. But above all, she had regained her trust in adults. Alejandro had kept all his promises, drastically reducing his business travel and delegating responsibilities to his collaborators. When he had to travel, Pablo came with him or the trip was postponed. There were no longer any urgent matters that would justify abandoning her son. His daily routine had become sacred. Alejandro accompanied Pablo to school every morning and often stayed to talk with other parents. In the afternoons, he helped with homework, not to check the grades, but because it had become their time together. The weekends were dedicated entirely to Pablo. They had explored every museum in Madrid, every park, every corner of the city. Alejandro had learned to see his city through the eyes of a child. The most important moment had arrived when Pablo asked for a dog. They had spent weeks at the shelters, choosing Lucky together, a mixed breed who needed a second chance, just like their relationship. Alejandro had also changed his approach to business. The company had introduced family life balance policies, and he had created a fund to support families in need. The real consecration had come when Paul invited him to speak in his class. Alejandro had told the children that being rich means having people who love you, not having a lot of money. When Paul looked at him with pride, Alexander understood that he had finally found true wealth. A year after that terrible episode, Alejandro and Pablo had built a relationship that seemed like a miracle to anyone who knew them. The cold and absent father had become the most present and loving man imaginable. And the traumatized and closed-off child had become a happy and confident child again. Alexander had made a revolutionary discovery. Being a present father didn't mean giving up on professional success, but rather completely redefining it. Vega Holdings continued to thrive, but was now guided by different principles. Alexander had learned that decisions made with serenity and emotional balance were often better than those made in the madness of blind ambition. His collaborators had noticed a change. Alejandro had become a more empathetic leader, more attentive to the human needs of his team. Meetings no longer dragged on until the wee hours for no reason. The goals were ambitious but realistic, and the work environment had become more serene and productive. Paul, for his part, had flourished in ways Alexander could never have imagined. The boy had developed an inner confidence that made him popular at school. He had forged sincere friendships with classmates who often came to play at home. Alejandro loved those chaotic afternoons filled with children running around the chalet, transforming those once sterile rooms into a true home. The relationship with Lucky, the dog they had adopted, had become special. Pablo had learned responsibility by caring for his four-legged friend. But above all, he had experienced the unconditional love that only an animal knows how to give. During one of their evening walks in the park, Pablo had asked a question that had deeply touched Alejandro. I had asked him if he felt sad about having lost all that money by spending less time at work. Alejandro had explained to him that he hadn't actually lost anything important. He had gained time, serenity, health, and above all, he had gained the respect and love of his son. The money he hadn't earned was nothing compared to what he had earned. The chance to see Pablo grow day by day. Alejandro had also discovered simple pleasures that his previous life had never allowed him to experience. Cooking together on Sunday mornings, watching animated films cuddled up on the couch, building sandcastles on vacation at the beach. But the real test of their new relationship came when Pablo came down with the flu. For Alejandro, who previously delegated every aspect of his son's care, personally caring for Pablo's illness had been a revelation. I had spent 3 days at home taking his temperature, preparing soups for him, and reading him stories to help him fall asleep. In those days of illness, Alejandro had seen how much their bond had grown. Pablo wasn't afraid when he was sick, because he knew that Dad was there and would take care of him. The most moving moment had come when Pablo, during his convalescence, had told him that he was the best dad in the world, not because he was rich or important, but because he always stayed with him when he needed him. Alejandro had also begun to tell Pablo about his mother, Isabel, in a more open and calm manner. He had previously avoided the subject because it hurt too much, but he understood that Pablo had the right to know and cherish his mother's memory. One night, while putting Pablo to bed after reading an adventure book together, the boy had asked him the most important question, whether he was happy with the life they were living together. Alejandro had responded without hesitation that it was the most beautiful life he had ever dreamed of. 2 years after that terrible afternoon that changed everything, Alejandro Vega had become a completely different man. The financial magnate, obsessed with power and money, had transformed into a caring father, a serene man, and a person who finally understood the value of important things. Pablo was 9 years old and had grown up to be a self-confident, affectionate, and extraordinarily mature boy for his age. The experience of abandonment, instead of breaking him, had made him stronger and more aware of the value of human relationships. He had grown into a child who appreciated every moment spent with the people he loved. The Moraleja Chalet had become a place full of life and warmth, no longer the perfect museum that Alejandro had built to impress guests and business partners, but a true home where a father and son made memories every day. The rooms echoed with the laughter of Pablo and his friends, with the sound of Lucky running through the hallways, with the music Alejandro had learned to love listening to his son's tastes. Alejandro had maintained his successful position in the business world, but he had completely redefined what success meant. Vega Holdings thrived under his more balanced and humane guidance. He had created a company culture that valued employee well-being as much as profits. But above all, Alejandro had discovered that being a present and involved father gave him an energy and creativity that also improved his professional performance. Solutions to business problems came to her more easily when her mind was calm and her heart filled with Pablo's love. The boy had become his source of inspiration at work as well. Seeing the world through the pure and fair eyes of his son Alejandro, he had begun to choose investments and partnerships that would have a positive impact on society. During one of their weekly dinners, which had become a sacred ritual, Pablo had asked a question that had a profound impact on Alejandro. I had asked him if he missed the money he hadn't earned by spending more time with him instead of working. Alejandro had explained to him that he had discovered something incredible. When you are happy and serene, you work better and smarter. Paradoxically, after reducing her work hours to be with Pablo, her earnings had increased because her decisions were more thoughtful and creative. But above all, he had told her, he had understood that there are things that money cannot buy, and that once lost, they cannot be recovered. Time with the people you love, the trust of child, the joy of watching them grow up happy and secure. These are the true riches. Pablo had listened with a seriousness that sometimes surprised Alejandro. Then he had made an observation that had touched her heart. He had told him that he was glad he had become a poor dad, because poor dads have time for their children. Alejandro had laughed as he explained to Pablo that they were still rich in money, but that now they were especially rich in love, time, and serenity, and that this was the most precious combination that existed. One spring night, as they sat in the garden watching Lucky play among the flowers, Pablo had shared with Alejandro a dream he was nurturing. He wanted to become a veterinarian to help animals like Lucky, who needed a second chance. That night, after putting Pablo to bed, Alejandro had stayed in his room for a long time watching him sleep. He thought back to that terrible afternoon 2 years earlier, when he had found his son begging the neighbors for food. Now he saw a serene child sleeping secure in his father's love and realized he had experienced his own personal miracle. She had lost a scared, affection-starved son and found a happy, confident boy. He had lost the version of himself obsessed with external success and had found the man he had always wanted to be, but had never had the courage to become. Alejandro got up from the armchair next to Pablo's bed and looked out the window at the moonlit garden. At that moment, surrounded by the serene silence of his loving home, he realized he was the richest man in the world, not because of the millions in his bank account, but because of the infinite wealth sleeping in the bed beside him, the unconditional love of his son, and the certainty of having finally understood what it truly meant to live. Like if you think presence is worth more than any expensive gift. Comment on which moment in history touched you the most. Share to inspire those who have forgotten what it means to be a parent. Subscribe for more stories of families reuniting. Sometimes you have to lose everything to understand that you had already won the lottery of life. Sometimes true success is in the laughter of a child who trusts you. And sometimes the richest dads are the ones who have time for a bedtime story. Oh,